Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for your solidarity and support. My name is Muhyiddin, and I am a volunteer with Arizona Palestine Solidarity Alliance, or APSA. We're going to use APSA from now on. Uh, we are living on autumn lands, the ancestral territories of indigenous people who inhabited these lands for centuries, and whose care and keeping of these lands allow us to be here today. Our brothers and sisters in the borderlands are now under attack. We in APSA stand in solidarity with our friends and allies in the Autumn Anti-Border Collective and all the water and sacred land protectors in their struggle against the wall, border militarization, and the destruction taking place by our government on their land. November 29th, yesterday, was the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. We stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people living under the brutal Israeli occupation and salute their resistance, steadfastness, and their struggle for justice, freedom, independence, and peace. We'd like to thank the Alliance for Global Justice, our fiscal sponsor, for using their Zoom account to host this webinar. And we very much appreciate Elaine Spivak Rodriguez, who's in the background here, for the great technical assistance she provided in setting up this webinar and running it now. We originally planned this conversation with Professor Chomsky for March 26, but as you all know, we had to cancel because of the pandemic. Professor Chomsky is a great friend of Palestine and the Palestinian people, and we appreciate his joining us today very much. We thank the very many organizations who co-sponsored the event in March, and appreciate their continued solidarity and support. These organizations include Derechos Humanos, Alliance for Global Justice, Jewish Voice for Peace, Progressive Democrats of America, Women International League for Peace and Freedom, Democratic Socialists of America, Black Lives Matter, Showing Up for Racial Justice, JVP USA Student Chapter, No More Death, Split Seed Productions, Tucson Peace Center, Nuclear Resistor, Casa Maria, Veterans for Peace Chapter 13, People's Defense Initiative, Tucson Samaritans, and Tucson for Burning. Again, thank you again for your solidarity and support. There are three segments in today's program after this introduction. First, Professor Chomsky will discuss the elections and their impact on Palestine, Israel, and the world. Jennifer will moderate this segment. Then he will discuss one of the biggest challenges we face in our work as Palestine solidarity activists, the issue of weaponizing anti-Semitism and using it against, using the anti-Semitism against advocates for Palestinian rights. Brooke will moderate this section. Then we will discuss Absal's work and the value and the importance of coalitions and Professor Chomsky's ideas on how to build a genuine solidarity movement. Sarah Roberts will moderate this function. Finally, we will have time for Q&A. We disabled the chat function during this seminar so we can all focus on the conversation. Please utilize the Q&A button to ask your questions as the webinar progresses. We may not be able to address all your questions tonight, but we will try to address all questions and issues later on. Please stay in touch with us and email us at arizonapalestine@gmail.com. Visit our website, Arizona Palestine, www.arizonapalestine.org, or our Facebook page. This webinar will be recorded and we will post the recording as soon as possible. When you go to our website, again, arizonapalestine.org, you will find a resources tab, which we try to keep updated with information about the issues that we face and about Palestine in general. There is also a donate button or a donate tab. We appreciate your tax-deductible donations very much. So please utilize that tab, the donate tab, if you can. And now we will get started. We are looking forward to a very interesting conversation here. So Jennifer, it's to you.
Thank you. This is a short introduction. Noam Chomsky is an American linguist, philosopher, cognitive scientist, historian, social critic, and political activist. Often called the father of modern linguistics, Chomsky is also referred to as one of the world's leading intellectuals. He is laureate professor of linguistics at the University of Arizona and institute professor emeritus at MIT. Noam Chomsky has been an activist for Palestinian human rights and self-determination since before most of us were born. He has lectured many times in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, including in the Gaza Strip, though the last time he was invited to give a lecture in the West Bank, Israel refused him entry. In the 1950s, Chomsky and his wife Carol lived on a kibbutz in Israel for a short time. But Chomsky has long opposed the idea of a Jewish state. Those familiar with the inherent contradictions involved in having an ethnic, national religious state and a genuine popular democracy will find this unsurprising. Tonight in this webinar, Professor Chomsky will discuss what lies ahead for Palestinians as the new Biden administration settles in and as new realities take shape in the Middle East. He will also talk about ways of building genuine Palestine solidarity with activists here and abroad. It is with pleasure and gratitude towards someone who has been a friend and a mentor to me for over 20 years to introduce Noam Chomsky.
Thank you. It's unnecessary to dwell on the fact that this is a grim, dangerous moment for Palestinians. And that means that we have to be very careful and clear-eyed, without illusion and sentimentality, in thinking about what the current situation is and what the opportunities are for us to do something about it. I'll begin by a couple of comments on the recent election. We can assume that the Trump policies will not be pursued by the incoming administration, at least to anything like the extent that they have been. The Trump administration was turned Israel-U.S. relations into a kind of a parody, a joke. Policies were essentially written on paper by the Israeli right wing, by Prime Minister Netanyahu, handed over to Jared Kushner to present to the world. Essentially, Israel received whatever it asked for. This includes what's called the greatest deal of the century, the sometimes called the Abraham agreements with other Arab states and so on. It's worth bearing in mind that if any other country had presented this proposal, if it had even been looked at, it would have been ridiculed. But when the United States presents it, it becomes the basis for further discussion. Everyone simply accepts it and asks, where can we go from here? It's an interesting sign of the extraordinary power that the United States wields in the international arena, not just on this issue, but dramatically on this issue. That's worth bearing in mind when we turn to the question of strategies and opportunities. Well, Biden won't go that far. He's very likely to pursue policies of pretty much the style of Barack Obama. This is assuming that he's not under substantial pressure from activists and solidarity groups, topic I'll return to. But absent that pressure, we can expect policies pretty much along the lines of Obama. And it's worth remembering that Obama was the most pro-Israel president in US history, in fact. He wasn't sufficiently, by Israeli standards, he was an enemy. But that's because Israel had moved so far to the right that even the normal subordination to Israeli policy was not considered sufficient. Have to go all the way a level of Trump to be acceptable to increasingly right-wing Israeli opinion. But in fact, Obama did break records in support for Israel. One of them was what he called his legacy, his last days in office, when he ensured that Israel would receive almost $40 billion over the next decade in US military aid, way beyond anything that's ever appeared in international affairs. But it was true all the way through. Other US presidents vetoed Security Council resolutions that were critical of Israel. Actually, if you go back far enough to the 1970 or so, the US actually used to sign those resolutions, but more recent years, the US vetoed them. But Obama was unique in that he actually went so far as to veto a Security Council resolution calling for the implementation of his policies. His policies formally were no expansion of the settlements, which is a minor issue. The issue, of course, is their existence. And when the Security Council endorsed that, February 2011, Obama vetoed it. That was unusual enough so that it actually made the news, which US vetoes rarely do. He is the only US president to have failed to impose specific demands on Israel. Reagan, the two Bushes, Clinton, all did impose demands, which Israel didn't at all like but had to obey. That's an important fact to keep in mind when we think about tactics. When the US lays down the law, Israel has no choices. Actually, that's true of most countries, but in particular, unusually so in the case of Israel, ever since the 1970s, when Israel made a fateful decision, this is under the Labor government, made a fateful decision to choose expansion over security. That left them in a vulnerable position in which they have to depend on the United States for support. Otherwise, they're basically lost. That was a decision consciously made, fateful decision, many consequences, follows until today. Well, these are all things to bear in mind. Let's turn to the current situation, what's happening in Israel, Palestine, and the region. First, let's talk a little about the region. And not only the region, but globally. It's very hard to find a coherent geostrategic plan in the chaos of the Trump administration. But there is one which has emerged, and the Middle East, Israel in particular, are at the center of it. The Trump administration has been assiduously working to develop a reactionary international, the most reactionary states in the world, led by the White House, which will serve as an international base for U.S. global power. How much this will survive into the Biden administration, we don't know. Again, it'll depend on popular pressures. But the idea is straightforward enough. So in the Western Hemisphere, the most harsh reactionary state is Bolsonaro's Brazil, the most important country in the continent outside the United States. He's a Trump clone. So Brazil is an eager member of the international. In the Middle East, it's based primarily on the family dictatorships that run the most of the international energy system, the harsh reactionary states, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, a couple of others. There, the basis of it includes al-Sisi's Egypt, the harshest dictatorship in Egypt's ugly history. Trump's favorite dictator, as he called him, he's core part of it. Over Israel is part, as Israel has moved very far to the right, it becomes part of this international reactionary alliance. The agreements between Israel and the Arab states, which are called peace agreements, of course, are not peace agreements. There was no war. In fact, there were tacit agreements of various kinds among these states and with Israel. They have now been brought to the fore, and that's a core part of the reactionary international. Farther to the east, Modi's India, natural member, close alliance with Israel, with the United States, destroying Indian secular democracy, crushing the rights of a couple hundred Muslims, destroying what's left of Kashmiri independence, not much, but now destroyed. So that's a natural member. In Europe, it includes people like Viktor Orban, he's essentially destroying Hungarian democracy, a number of others, Mario Salvini, others of the same kind. Well, that's an international system And that's the context in which the Abraham agreements find their place and in which Israel is being openly integrated into the Middle East base of the International Reactionary Alliance. How much of that will remain, we don't know. Depend a lot on popular action. But we should recognize that it has been an achievement of the Trump administration. Well, looking more locally, Israel-Palestine, much of the discussion of the fate of Israel-Palestine is based on what I think is an illusion. We should be clear about it. Most discussion, almost all in fact, poses two alternatives. One alternative is the two-state option that was proposed in the mid-70s that the United States and Israel rejected at the United Nations Security Council and elsewhere, and but has become a very broad international consensus, virtually, almost without exception, most of the world, in principle at least. So that's one option. The second option that's discussed is what's called a one-state settlement. Israel takes over all of the West Bank, and then the Palestinians can be faced with an anti-apartheid struggle. Sometimes this is compared with South Africa. It's not a good comparison, and I don't think it's a serious option. Recall in South Africa, the white population, nationalist population, needed the black population. They were 85% of the population. They were the workforce. They were the ones who went into the mines, did the dirty work in the country, and so on. That's not the role of the Palestinians in Israel-Palestine. Israel would be delighted to just expel them, get rid of them, doesn't want them. True, Israel has used them for what amounts to, and is sometimes called slave labor, but Israel doesn't require the Palestinians for that. It can find slave labor from Thailand, other countries, as it does in fact use. So Israel's not interested in maintaining the Palestinians the way South Africa was committed to, required to maintain the Bantustans, try to give them some international credibility, even some support. That's not the situation in Israel-Palestine. But the greater problem is that Israel does not want and will not agree to take in to within its sovereignty a large Palestinian population. Israel will not agree to become a state with a Jewish minority. That's not Israel's goal. They'll never accept it. There's no international support for it. So I think that is simply not an option that's a serious one to consider. There is a third option, which is not being discussed, but it's the main one. And that's what we see developing before our eyes. In fact, it's been developing for 50 years. Slowly, step by step, following the procedures that led to the establishment of the Zionist movement in Palestine and the state of Israel. Slow moves, step by step, often under the radar. So you go back 100 years, the policy was set up a guard post somewhere. Nobody notices. Bring in a couple of people, a few goats, nobody pays attention. Build a fence, okay, who knows? Pretty soon you have a community. That's the policy. There was a name for it. Dunam after dunam. Take one dunam after another, just keep building it. And that's been followed a little more openly since roughly 1970, since after the June 67 war. Most started under it's bipartisan, under the Labor Party, under Shimon Peres, under Yitzhak Rabin, Begin, Sharon. It's variants of essentially the same policy. And what it's aimed for explicitly, and what you can see on the ground if you travel in the West Bank, is to establish a greater Israel in which the population will be overwhelmingly Jewish. You won't have to face this famous demographic problem. Too many non-Jews in a Jewish state. Includes, first of all, greatly expanded Jerusalem, now maybe 5 times what it ever was historically, taking in surrounding Arab villages from which the Arabs are pretty much expelled or suppressed, separated from the West Bank. Includes the town of Ma'ale Adumim to the east of Jerusalem, of Greater Jerusalem, a town that grew up mostly under the Clinton administration, is now a substantial town. A connection between Greater Jerusalem and Ma'ale Adumim, so-called E1, gradually being built up. Technically, the United States opposes it, but doesn't do anything when another small step is taken. That essentially bisects the habitable part of the West Bank. Further to the north, similar arrangements, the town of Ariel, Kadumim, connections to the Israeli-held areas. It includes the so-called seam, the territory between the annexation wall and Israel. The security wall, as it's called, has nothing to do with security and never did. It includes the Jordan Valley. It's about a third of the West Bank, much of the fertile land. Population has been gradually expelled in one or another, by one or another means, things ranging from setting up a military region in which everyone has to leave, except when you look, a Jewish settlement is built there, digging deep wells which undermine the Palestinian possibilities of getting water, a whole variety of means, familiar for 100 years now with a powerful state behind them. That's essentially taken over by Israel. As for the rest, places Israel does not want Nablus, does not want Tulkarm, does not want to take in the heavy Palestinian population concentrations. The remnants of the rural areas are divided into small enclaves, probably close to 200 of them by now, where an Arab village will be separated from its olive groves, its land, its herding areas by guard posts, occasionally let open at the will of the soldiers who guard them. But basically the idea is to make life essentially unlivable. If people leave, that's fine. Otherwise, they'll be kind of marginalized and not part of the visible society. There are huge infrastructure projects. You can move from your subsidized villa in the West Bank to your job in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem without ever on a major superhighway restricted to Jews, of course. And you might not know that an Arab exists, except maybe off in the distance, somebody herding a goat, which gives a nice biblical flavor to it. That's Greater Israel, which is developing before our eyes, it's taking shape, and is the actual alternative to a two-state settlement. And I think we should be clear about the fact that those are the options that are presented now, that exist now as the alternatives that can be realized. Of course, it is commonly claimed that the two-state alternative is finished, it's dead. If that's true, then we're left with Greater Israel. But I'm not convinced that it's true. Depends very much on U.S. policy. If the U.S. shifts policy, could change. As I mentioned, Israel basically has no options other than to rely on the United States. And that means that for policies for people on the ground, they have to work out for themselves. But as far as we're concerned, in the United States, it means we have both a challenge and an opportunity. We can, solidarity groups, activist groups here, can make a major difference on what the outcome will be by affecting US policy. Now, here we have to pay attention to what's happening in the United States, and it's significant. You go back a couple of decades, the base for support for Israel was primarily in the liberal community. Israel was the darling of the liberal community, not just in the United States. Swedish college students would go to this marvelous social democratic paradise, live in a kibbutz, go back to Sweden. That's changed radically since the 1970s and dramatically since the vicious assaults on Gaza, which made a huge difference. Policies, the attitudes in the United States have significantly changed. I mean, I've seen it in my own experience. Up until a decade or 15, 20 years ago, if I wanted to give a talk on Israel-Palestine in a college campus, I had to have police protection. Police insisted on taking me back to my car or wherever I was staying on campus because there were severe threats. Meetings were broken up. Meetings were often under airport security with, bags checked when you go in, harassment on campus, harassment and threats against faculty who dared to invite me to campus, all sorts of things. That's all totally gone, totally changed. In fact, the most dramatic change, I think, was after Cast Lead, which had a big impact. But more generally, as Israel shifted far to the right, became visibly more oppressive than the support. Sorry, I see from the chat that I'm not being heard well. I'll try to talk louder. As this happened, support for Israel has, among the liberal sectors of the community and among younger people generally, has declined substantially. The base for support for Israel today in the United States is the right wing. It used to be the Democratic Party. It's now mostly the Republican Party. It's evangelicals, ultranationalists, the military sectors, which have very close relations with Israel, military and so-called security sectors, intensive relations. But it's not the liberal or younger part of the population, and it's declining. Those are significant facts that could sooner or later, sooner I hope, turn into have an impact on US government policy, which would have a dramatic effect on Israel-Palestine. In fact, that is the main hope that I can see for some measure of justice for Palestinians in both in the occupied territories, in Israel, and in the miserable refugee camps elsewhere. This includes Gaza, incidentally. That's a possibility. But that means that if that's correct, that analysis, it means that we should be thinking of the kinds of strategic actions, the kind of tactical choices that will maximize these possibilities. And there are a number which are quite significant, and I think which could gain very substantial support in the United States. Let's take a topic that's right on the front pages constantly, an impending war with Iran. Iran, bipartisan opinion in the United States, elite opinion, considers Iran what's called the greatest threat to world peace. That's bipartisan. It was the same in the Obama administration. Iran is the greatest threat to world peace. The Iranian threat to develop nuclear weapons is an intolerable one, be much too great a danger for the United States or certainly Israel to tolerate. That's bipartisan. The goal of the JCPOA, the joint agreement that Obama initiated, was to delay the development of this terrible threat. Actually, U.S. intelligence has said something about the nature of the threat in its regular reports to Congress during the Obama administration when this agreement was established. Now, what U.S. intelligence reported was public is that Iran, of course, has very low military expenditures by the standards of the region. Obviously, everyone is low relevant to the United States, but even by regional standards, Iran is a very minor military force. Its strategic doctrine is defensive, designed to deter an attack, an invasion long enough for diplomacy to be initiated. They point out that if Iran is developing nuclear capacity, nuclear weapons capacity, which they didn't know, it would be part of their deterrent strategy. Well, who is worried about a deterrent? Only countries that want to rampage freely in the region. For them, a deterrent is an unacceptable threat. And there are, in fact, two such countries, the United States and Israel. They want to be free to do whatever they want in the region, to bomb, to kidnap, to attack, to do anything they want. And Iran is indeed a deterrent. That's the threat. Now, what's the threat now? Well, take a look at current front pages. There's speculation as to whether the Trump administration is trying to provoke hardliners in Iran to take some action which can be used as a pretext for a major attack, like a missile attack on the nuclear facilities or something like that. That's not an implausible analysis. It's a little hard to explain recent actions except in those terms. So I think the mainstream analysts who are suggesting this are probably coming close to contemplated, maybe intended policies. And recall that on these issues, the Biden administration, though not as extreme as Trump, is not all that different. So the emerging position of the Biden administration, really recently enunciated by Jake Sullivan, one of the incoming military advisors, but also by others, is that the United States will be, under Biden, will be willing to, it may be willing, they say, to return to the joint agreement if Iran revokes its recent steps to enrich uranium, and if Iran approaches the agreement by basically appealing to the United States and making clear that it's willing to accept negotiations to improve the agreement. The ball's in their court. It's their responsibility. if we impose harsh, brutal, murderous sanctions on Iran, that's just our right. After all, we're the global ruler. We saw a dramatic illustration of that just a couple of weeks ago. The UN sanctions, actually imposed under US initiative, actually ran out. They expired. The United States wanted them renewed, went to the Security Council, asked for them to be renewed. Security Council totally refused. Every US ally refused. So what happened? Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State, went back to the Security Council and said, sorry, folks, you're reinstituting the sanctions. That's power manifested. Very little comment on it, taken for granted. And of course, they basically have no choice. If you defy the United States, you can get thrown out of the international financial system, other punishments. So the United States is entitled to impose murderous sanctions, to assassinate leaders, to carry out sabotage, blow up installations, carry out major cyber war attacks. All of that's legitimate. It's Iran's problem to show that it's willing to enter into legitimate negotiations with us. Well, let's take for granted, for the sake of argument, that Iran is a threat. Let's agree. Disagree with American intelligence, but agree with the political class, both parties. It's a threat. Its nuclear weapons are a threat. We have to do something about it. Is there a way to terminate the threat of Iranian nuclear weapons? Well, in fact, there's a very simple way. And this relates closely to advocacy work for Palestinian rights. Just think it through. This is something that everyone who thinks about it knows, but nobody talks about. It's under a taboo in the United States, but it's right on the surface. You want to end Iranian nuclear weapons, institute a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East with intensive inspections. And we know that inspections work. We have the experience of the last 2 years when even American intelligence agrees that the inspection regime under the joint agreement worked very successfully. So institute a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East of the kind that does exist in other parts of the world. Let's do that. Is there a barrier to it? Certainly not from the Arab states. They've been calling for it vigorously for 25 years. Certainly not from Iran, which is strongly in favor of it, openly and strongly advocating it. What about the global South, most of the world's population, formally organized in, it's called G77, about 130 countries, strongly in support of it, have been calling for it loudly. Europe supports it. What's the problem? Problem is right here. Every time it comes up in international negotiations, the United States vetoes it. Last one was Obama, 2015. The review session of the Non-Proliferation Treaty every 5 years. Obama came up, as it always does. Obama vetoed it. Of course, Israel strongly against it. The reason is perfectly obvious. Everyone knows it. The United States does not want the Israeli nuclear arsenal to be inspected and under international controls. Therefore, the US vetoes the easiest way, some straightforward way to end whatever nuclear threat Iran poses. In fact, the United States does not officially recognize that Israel has nuclear weapons. And there's a reason for that. US law, Symington Amendment, other provisions make it arguably illegal for the United States to provide economic or military aid to Israel because it's developing nuclear weapons out of the framework of the international arms controls agreements. Neither political party wants to open that door. The intellectual community doesn't talk about it, doesn't appear in the media. You can find it discussed in the arms control literature, but that's about as far as it gets. So here's a very simple way to end the allegedly greatest threat to world peace, cut off the danger of growing war, which could be quite serious. Straightforward. Why is it not happening? Because the United States wants to protect its arguably illegal military and economic aid to Israel. I don't think the American population would be happy about that if they knew about it. In fact, much of the population doesn't like foreign aid altogether. The idea that we're facing extreme risk, going to enormous expense, probably danger of war, in order to protect military and economic aid that's arguably illegal, that would not sell very well. And in fact, one of the things that Palestinian solidarity groups should be doing is pressing on that. That's a strong arguing point against the kind of support that Israel is giving, that the United States is giving to Israel and its policies of harsh and brutal occupation. And if that support is taken away, policies can't continue. Recall again what I started with. When the United States gives orders, Israel has to follow them. In fact, that's true of the world pretty generally, as we just saw at the UN Security Council. But it's particularly true of Israel, which has chosen back in the 70s to rely totally on the United States for survival, part of its decision, a consequence of its decision to choose expansion over security. That's a weak point in support for Israeli policies, which can be pursued. And there are others. There's other US laws. The so-called Lay law, Patrick Lay, forbids US military aid to any military units that are engaged in systematic human rights abuses. The IDF, the Israeli Armed Forces, are constantly engaged in severe human rights abuses. You can read it in the human rights reports of the main Israeli human rights organization, B'Tselem, International Human Rights Reports. Several fine journalists in Israel, like Gidon Levy, Amir Haas, constantly reporting it. It's not secret. That can be pressed. Well, I think these are options that should be thought about in trying to ask ourselves how we can act to support Palestinian rights. There are many ways, and unfortunately, those ways are not being pursued. They could be, they could make a big difference. We should, there's more to say about choice of tactics and actions, but I'll stop at this point and leave the floor to you.
Okay, thank you. I would like to introduce Brooke Hotez, who is a doctoral candidate at the University of Arizona and a member of Jewish Voice for Peace. She will be asking you another set of questions. Thanks.
Thank you. Hi, Professor Chomsky. I'm just going to dive right in. I have a few questions for you. It's interesting to hear you speak about these things and how there are alliances and solidarity groups that are affecting US policy, and there's more things that we can do about that. So I'll ask you about that in a moment, but something that I've noticed is that as activists in the United States speak out for Palestinian rights, it seems that there's an escalation in the weaponization of anti-Semitism to stifle that debate. And it really, it can really have a terrible effect depending on who is targeted for these smear campaigns. And so I'm curious what you think about some things that have happened under the Trump administration that might not be easily reversible. For instance, just less than 2 weeks ago, US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo issued a statement saying that, quote, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, end quote. Pompeo's statement comes alongside his official visit to an illegal Jewish settlement in the occupied West Bank, where he announced that all goods made in illegal settlements will now be labeled as products of Israel, which reverses longstanding US policy. Professor Chomsky, I'm just wondering, is there a connection here between Pompeo's statement about anti-Zionism and his official visit to illegal settlements in the West Bank?
Well, we should remember that these are statements by the outgoing administration, which can be pretty easily withdrawn. But I think the question which we should be asking ourselves is, have our tactics helped develop the charges of anti-Semitism? There are tactics that would not encourage that development. So, for example, the Presbyterian Church has adopted strong policy of boycotts and divestment against anything involving the occupied territories, including even U.S. corporations involved in the territories in any way. They've never been accused of anti-Semitism. In fact, if you look closely, actions that have been taken, activist work that has focused on the occupied territories, has not elicited accusations of anti-Semitism. And there's a very good reason for that. It's simply saying, let's follow international law and the positions of the major actors in the world, even the human rights organizations. Now, it's true that Pompeo went so far as to attack Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, but that's a losing game. The US is not going to win that on the international sphere or even among American opinion. The kinds of actions that have been brought to the fore and that have been the basis for the outrageous laws, charges of anti-Semitism and so on, are different ones, not these. That tells us something. That tells us if our tactics are focused on Israeli crimes in the occupied territories, we have a very strong case. Chances of bringing up charges of anti-Semitism are slight, and they wouldn't get anywhere. It's important to think about, like Presbyterian Church and others have taken this position is a good example. The United States does make a fuss when the European Union says it's going to label products from the occupied territories as from Palestine, not from Israel. U.S. gets angry, but doesn't do anything. That doesn't have much hold. That's a very difficult position for the U.S. to maintain. And the charges of anti-Semitism are based on other things, like the demand that Israel should accept all Palestinian refugees. Now, that does open charges of anti-Semitism. It allows, this is independent of whether it's a right or wrong, quite apart from whether it's right or wrong. If you're a serious activist, you want to help the victims, you ask yourself, what are the consequences of taking that position? It's always a question that serious activists have to raise, no matter what the issue, in the United States, anywhere else. Not, do I think I'm right, but what are the consequences going to be? And the consequences of this will be immediately that there'll be a charge saying you want to destroy Israel. You want millions of Palestinians to come and overwhelm Israel. Okay, that's going to be the charge. Same with other things. Tactics have to be selected so you don't give weapons into the hands of your enemies. You don't carry out tactical moves that are going to strengthen those who want to destroy you. Same with, could give examples right here now, in fact, about slogans that are used, but it's constant. Okay, I think those are things that ought to be thought through quite carefully. Tactical choices are sometimes disparaged as not principled. That's wrong. They're what matters to the victims. The victims don't care what your principles are. They care what actions you carry out and the effect on them. And that's what serious activists have to keep in mind.
Mm. Well, and in terms of Palestinian refugees, just what you're saying, it makes me think that tactically speaking, we could focus on the human rights, the crimes against, you know, the living conditions and the situation of Palestinian refugees. We could focus on the human rights abuses and tactically speaking as a way to draw attention to the issue.
But the question of the human rights of refugees happens to arise practically in the places where they are, in Lebanon, for example, in Jordan. That's where there are serious, immediate human rights problems regarding the refugees. We should face the reality of the fact that whatever we think about the rights of the refugees, mass refugee return is not going to happen. There's no support for it in the world. There actually is no real legal support for it. If it ever gained any support, Israel would use its ultimate weapons to prevent it, for obvious reasons. The Palestinian negotiators have always understood this. You go back to the negotiations, back to the 70s. This was put forth as a public demand, but in the quiet negotiations in the back rooms was always understood that at most there'll be some kind of symbolic return. That goes back to the internal discussions way back to the 70s. And that's because they have to recognize they live in the real world. Can't say, it's like in the United States, for example, there's proposals to remove statues of Robert E. Lee. There's no proposal to evacuate Washington. Okay, you can make a case for it. Washington was a brutal slaveholder, as a symbol of the destruction of the extermination of the indigenous population. Why not remove it? Well, no serious advocate of indigenous American rights proposes that, because that's not going to happen. You want to propose things that might happen, okay? Not that you think are right, at least if you're serious about the victims.
Mm. Well, I'm thinking about, you know, being in solidarity with Palestinians who actually live in the occupied territories, who live in refugee camps, and who necessarily are anti-Zionist, and they, you know, Palestinian politics with regard to Israel is necessarily anti-Zionist. And so how can we as allies to Palestinian rights support them in their own politics, if that makes sense what I'm asking? Because if it's conflated with anti-Semitism, how can Palestinians even communicate in an understandable way their experience of history and their experience as victims of Zionism, if they can't even, if they're accused of anti-Semitism for even speaking about what it's like to be Palestinian?
Well, we should, in fact, make very clear the plight of the Palestinians who are refugees. We should make very clear the plight of indigenous people in the United States, many others like them, but we should accompany that with efforts to improve their lives, not to make their lives worse, okay? Not to take positions which cannot be realized and will offer fodder, help to those who want to destroy the Palestinians by giving them an opening to say, you're just all a bunch of nuts, anti-Semites, let's make you illegal. Okay. That doesn't help Palestinians, doesn't help Palestinian refugees. Just as it would make no sense for indigenous rights activists in the United States to say, let's destroy Washington. It's the worst symbol of our oppression. You can believe that, you can discuss it, you can bring it to the consciousness of the population, but it's not a tactic.
Within Israel, you know, in terms of, you were just mentioning earlier how the State Department earlier this month also announced plans to label these leading global human rights organizations as anti-Semitic, and you were commenting that that's not going to hold, but you know, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been accusing human rights activists in Palestine of anti-Semitism for quite some time. Israeli Jews fighting for Palestinian rights are called terrorist sympathizers and traitors to the Jewish people. And so how can we in the US support Israeli Jews who are on the ground doing this hard work and who are really risking social ostracization for, you know, speaking out?
Of course, you support dissidents everywhere. Support people like Gideon Levy, Amir Haas, others, Zochrot, soldiers, resistors, everything. That's everywhere. So it's in Israel too. But notice that it's not Benjamin Netanyahu. This goes back to the respected figures of the Labor Party. So back almost 50 years ago, Abba Eban, highly respected international statesman, you know, greatly revered, as mainly because he had a nice Oxford accent. Therefore, a wonderful person. Foreign, you know, he back in 1972, I think it was, you can look it up, he wrote an interesting article in the most liberal American Jewish journal, Congress Weekly, Journal of the American Jewish Congress, which is a relatively liberal organization. The article was quite interesting. And it was advice, or in fact, orders really, to American Jews. It said, your task is to show that there is no difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, where anti-Zionism meant opposition to the policies of his government, the liberal Labor government, Golda Meir government. He was a foreign minister. So you have to show that's your task as an American Jew, a liberal American Jew, show that there's no difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And he even picked two examples. One was I.F. Stone, dedicated Zionist, but critical of Israeli policies. So he's an anti-Semite. The second was me, dedicated anti-Zionist, you know, and anti-Semite and so on. So the two of us are consumed by guilt over Jewish survival, kind of a neurotic Jewish self-hatred. So we're kind of out on the margins, you don't worry about us. But you have to show that others who are what he calls anti-Zionist, meaning critical of the policies of the state of Israel, are just anti-Semites. Have we survived for 50 years? Yeah. Okay, that's the official policy of the liberal side of the Israeli government, Abba Eban, left labor, so on. Okay, you live with it and you go on. Doesn't matter. Called worse names than that. That's the price of being involved in critique of power. In the United States, we're called wild men in the wings. That's McGeorge Bundy, the national security advisor for Johnson and Kennedy. Former Harvard dean, wrote an important article in 1968, peak of anti-war activity, saying, well, there are those who criticize our tactics, say we're making mistakes. That's understandable. But then there are people who actually question our motives, who say we're not wonderful humanists trying to bring democracy to the people of South Vietnam. We're murderers who are destroying them, which of course was the fact. They're wild men in the wings, so we can dismiss them. Okay, if you want to be critic of American policy, yes, you're a wild man in the wings. That comes with the turf. It's of no interest. Of course, that's true. It's always been true.
Hmm. So I'll just have one more quick question for you, and then we're going to move on to the next segment here. So just on that final note about speaking out and understanding the consequences of what we say and making these tactical decisions and choices, do you think that Jewish voices have a particular role to play when Palestinian rights activists are singled out and the targets of an onslaught of threats and smear campaigns? Do you think that Jewish activists have some kind of particular role to play here in terms of building solidarity and pressuring the United States foreign policy?
Do the Jewish activists have a responsibility to protect Palestinians who are under attack? Is that the question?
Yeah.
Of course.
Right.
That's our main concern, is the Palestinians, those who are suffering brutally, and particularly in Gaza, also in the West Bank, where there's daily atrocities, so-called hilltop youth, religious settlers who go storming into a Palestinian village, shoot it up, kill people, torture them. Jewish settlers who tear down olive groves, who even settlers there were cases reported by B'Tselem, the human rights group, of settlers who had COVID-19, who went into a Palestinian village to try to spread it. I mean, these things could just go on constantly. Of course, we should be involved in protecting them. We should be committed that should be our main concern. Gaza is even worse. Gaza is a horror chamber. It's amazing that they survive. That should be the place is virtually becoming uninhabitable.
Mm-hmm.
These should be our concern. If Palestinian activists are under threat here, of course we should support them. I mean, take Edward Said, was a close personal friend for many years. He was under such threats that in his apartment, he had to have a way to press a button to communicate with the local police in case anything happened. Yes, there's a serious threat. As I mentioned, even my own experience, which is not unusual, was threat serious enough so that you had to have police protection if you gave a talk on campus. I never thought it was a very serious threat, but it's unpleasant to be walking around with police following you. But that's the kind of thing that happens when you oppose powerful systems. It was the same in the early days of opposition to the Vietnam War. The same with feminists, same with others. Yes, you get attacked. People in power don't like criticism. Not a big surprise. Goes back in history as far as you want.
Well, Professor Chomsky, thank you so much for your time and insight. It's been an honor to speak with you. And next we have Sarah Roberts with APSA, who will continue to speak with you all about building solidarity.
Good evening, Professor Chomsky, and good evening, everyone. I'll speak for a few minutes about the work of APSA, Arizona Palestine Solidarity Alliance, which is an anti-militarization group working to build a regional movement opposing the ongoing US-Israeli partnership that both supports the brutal occupation of the Palestinian people and lands and the increasing militarization of the US-Mexico border region. As a coalition of groups and individuals working together, APSA is a part of a global movement for a campaign of boycott, divestment, and sanctions until Israel complies with international law. APSA works in coalition to partner in a regional effort to expose and oppose this US-Israeli partnership in the new wave of militarization of the southern Arizona border region and Tohono O'odham lands. Our network connects movements in southern Arizona with the Palestinian-led international BDS movement and other Palestinian solidarity efforts. Native, indigenous, migrant, and other anti-colonial, anti-racist, anti-militarization efforts in southern Arizona are part of our coalition. We focus on educating our communities about the connections between justice in the US-Mexico borderlands and justice in Palestine, seeking collaborative efforts with social movements that oppose police and border patrol violence. We seek to practice and promote a vision of interconnected struggles for collective liberation. Our network includes many groups, and Moyedin has mentioned the number of groups at the beginning of the meeting today. And so I will refer you to our website, which is arizonapalestine.org, for a list of the groups and organizations that work in coalition. Starting in 2014, APSA began organizing teach-ins on Palestine, Zionism, the occupation, and the effects of border militarization on Tohono O'odham and other indigenous people along the Arizona-Mexico border. Other activities of APSA have included fundraising events for humanity to Gaza, public films and discussions, a public forum on BDS, and a field trip to the Arizona border to bring attention to the role Israel plays in the militarization of the US-Mexico border with Elbit surveillance towers. And most recently, APSA work has included participation in coalitional campaigns within the state of Arizona to defeat bills that equate Palestinian solidarity work with anti-Semitism. And these bills, these Arizona state legislative bills, are expected to be brought back in 2021. We have also worked to defeat anti-boycott legislation here in Arizona. And in July of this year, 2020, APSA released a report entitled Facing Down Settler Colonialism, O'odham Palestinian Struggles, shining a light on the increasing militarization of Palestinian and US-Mexico borderlands, including an analysis of settler colonialist strategies, such as the dispossession of natural resources like water. Authors and editors of the report include Gabriel Scibone, Todd Miller, Blake Gentry, Jeffrey Boyce, and Rebecca Cartel, and several others. Thank you to all our authors and editors. APSA collaborated with Visualizing Palestine, a multidisciplinary collective that creates data-led visual stories to advance a factual, rights-based narrative of Palestine and Israel. And they created a visual infographic called Watched. And I would refer you to our website to download both the report and the infographic. So at APSA, we invite you and call on you to commit to making Palestinian solidarity a part of your work as individuals and organizations. We invite you to join our coalition and to contact us at arizonapalestine@gmail.com or to contact us through our website and to like our Facebook page. We are happy to work with your organizations to provide educational presentations and public forums. And with that, we'll jump back into the questions. And I have just another question that will ask about additional reflections from you, Dr. Chomsky, about creating genuine solidarity. How do we create genuine solidarity and build solidarity in our movements, within and between our movements with the Palestinian people? And can you comment on the importance of coalition work?
Well, there's no real secrets. It's the way all activist groups, successful ones, develop. It begins with basically education, trying to get people to see things that are not in front of their eyes. If there's the violence that goes on in the occupied territories, doesn't get reported in the American press. The human rights reports aren't known. So what's happening to Gaza is barely known. I'll tell you an anecdote. When I came back from a trip in which I had been in Gaza, at the immigration office, when you come in, you speak to an immigration officer and ask you where you've been, you list the countries where you've been. One of them I listed was Gaza. He looked puzzled. He said, "What's that?" I said, "Well, to describe it briefly." And he said, "Oh yeah, they have a lot of trouble there, don't they?" That was an immigration officer. People have no idea. Okay, the things that are more complex, like I don't think they're complex. Like take what I said about Iran. Nobody knows about that. Nobody knows that we have an easy way to settle any threat that anyone thinks Iran poses, but it's blocked by our commitment to provide arguably illegal aid to Israel. I think if people in Tucson knew about that, they would not be happy about it. Okay? Plenty of things like that, which people cannot be involved with unless they know about them. So the beginning is try to expand understanding. Then find the kinds of actions that people can actually take. Not let's overthrow the government, but something you can do. Okay, small thing that you can do to get started with. Maybe move towards trying to set up some sister city arrangement or something like that. Get something that people can become involved in. They'll learn more. They'll get further involved. Pretty soon you have a movement going. That's the way every activist movement developed. I mean, take, say, civil rights movement. It took a big step forward in 1960 when a couple of young Black students in Greensboro, North Carolina, sat in at a segregated lunch counter in Woolworth, Greensboro. They were, of course, immediately arrested, dragged off. Could have ended it, except the next day some more came back. Pretty soon there were more. Pretty soon you had the formation of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was the cutting edge of the civil rights movement. Pretty soon you had some young people, white people coming in from the North. Then you had freedom riders going through rural Alabama, risking their lives because it was really dangerous to try to encourage intimidated Black farmers to dare to vote. People were killed. It was pretty brutal. Keep on with that for a couple of years. Pretty soon you have a massive march on Washington. You get some civil rights legislation passed. Every single movement is like that. Anti-war movement was like that. Feminist movement, environmental movement, everything in history. It's not easy. It can take a long time. Feminist movement goes back to early 19th century. Wasn't until 1975 that women were granted the legal right of peers, the right to serve in federal juries as peers. Pretty recent. We had anti-sodomy laws in the United States up into this millennium. It takes work, Nothing comes easily, but it can be done. And there are many opportunities in this case which have not been exploited adequately, I think, like the ones I mentioned.
Yes, thank you. I appreciated the very creative strategies that you mentioned earlier. Appreciated that. And now I think in the interest of time, I will go ahead and turn it over to Ellen and Mohyuddin for the question and answer section. Thank you very much.
Okay, hi. Thank you all very much. We have a few questions in the Q&A. While we are doing that, let me just do a follow-up about the discussion of weaponizing anti-Zionism. As you know, Professor Chomsky, the definition of anti-Semitism by the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Committee, has been used to, in many cases, to criminalize practically freedom of speech in this country and to stifle any criticism of Israel. And several attempts in many states, actually 21 states so far, have been, that is, how do we as advocates for Palestine, for Palestinian rights, deal with this, environment where it's really makes it very difficult to do, and it just makes our activism very difficult to do. And what advice do you tell progressives in particular about how to deal with this issue?
I didn't hear everything, but are you speaking about the IHRA declaration on anti-Semitism?
Right.
Well, one way to deal with it is the way that was just done a couple of days ago by a large group of both Palestinian and other Arab intellectuals who came out with a strong statement, widely publicized in Europe, not in the United States as far as I know. It's now being giving a sharp, accurate critique of the IHRA proposals on anti-Semitism. My friend Gil Ashkar, well-known scholar, Lebanese originally, now teaching in England, is trying to circulate it in the United States. Could help him do it. That's one way to do it. Other ways are for us to do who are not, I couldn't sign it because it's for Palestinians and Arab intellectuals, but we can do the same things. It was used in a very vicious way in England to undermine Jeremy Corbyn with really odious charges of anti-Semitism, which collapsed quickly on inspection, but were used to undermine his efforts to develop a serious Labor Party that would be participatory, not just run by a bunch of bureaucrats, and would have the interests of the population at heart. Policies very successful. Scared the conservative leadership of the Labor Party, scared them to death. They cooperated with virtually the whole range of British media to kill his candidacy, his policies, and pretty much drive him out of the political arena with charges of, a large part was spurious charges of anti-Semitism based on this definition. Well, there has been some reaction to that in England, but there should be similar, stronger reactions here. And we can look at the provisions of the statement. So, for example, it says that if you hold Jews collectively responsible for the actions of the state of Israel, or you target the state of Israel as a Jewish collectivity, that's a sign of anti-Semitism. Well, okay, that says that the Israeli Supreme Court is anti-Semitic, okay, because they take that position. Their official position, way back to 1960, is that Israel is the state of the Jewish people. It's my state, not your state if you're a citizen of Israel. Okay? Well, so the Supreme Court of Israel is anti-Semitic. Let's go on. Accusing Israel of exaggerating the Holocaust. Okay? That's Abba Eban. One of his famous quips is a critique of those who exaggerate the Holocaust for political purposes. The way he put it was pretty vulgar. He said, there's no business like Shoah business. Okay, that's Abba Eban, distinguished Israeli statesman. So he's anti-Semitic. Drawing comparisons of Israeli policies to that of the Nazis. Well, that would include, for example, one of the leading, most respected, even revered Jewish intellectuals, Israeli intellectuals, Yehoshua Leibovitz, who predicted years ago in the early days of the occupation that it would turn Jews into what he called Judeo-Nazis. Okay, so he's an anti-Semite. By parity of reasoning, we're all bitter racist accusers of the United States, because major US scholarship, mainstream scholarship, discusses openly the ways in which the Nazis took on American laws when they established their racist regime, but couldn't really accept them fully because the American laws, the anti-miscegenation laws, were too extreme for the Nazis. So wipe out all that scholarship. And it goes on like that. We should make all that clear. There is no justification for any of these things. It's indecent. We should strongly oppose it, much the way the statement by the Palestinian and Arab intellectuals did just a couple of days ago. All of that's perfectly possible, significant, useful educational activity, which makes people think, brings them in, asks them to make them inquire themselves into the underlying issues, what lies behind it. That's the way you build consciousness and awareness. So use it as an opportunity.
Okay. Thank you. There is a question here of which says this year has witnessed an unprecedented rise in censorship, wealth transfer, wealth gap, and surveillance state. What is your assessment of this, and will this take us closer to a 1984 dystopia?
Sorry, I didn't catch it. Could somebody who heard repeat it for me?
Sure, I can do that.
Yeah.
This year has witnessed an unprecedented rise in censorship, wealth transfer, wealth gap, and surveillance state. What is your assessment of this, and will this take us closer to a 1984 dystopia?
That's referring to the United States,
Yeah.
I believe
transfer of wealth and so on. We should take a look at it. It's very interesting. There was actually a study that just came out from a super respectable organization, Rand Corporation, quasi-governmental, major institute that works on policy and does studies of all kinds. They came out with a study of exactly this question. How much wealth has been transferred from the working class and the middle class to the very rich during the period since Reagan, the 40 neoliberal years? Their estimate is $47 trillion transferred, robbed would be the right word, from the working class and the middle class. That's, for them, that's the lower 90% of the population, to the very rich. And it didn't just go to the top 10%. It went to a fraction of the top 10%. So the top 0.1%, not 0.1% of the population has doubled their wealth, for their share of wealth, since Reagan, from 10% to 20%. And all of this is an underestimate. Reagan also opened the spigots on ways to rob the public, like tax havens, which were illegal before Reagan, and the Treasury Department enforced it. Open those, you get tens of trillions of dollars more being robbed. So it's happening in all kinds of ways. It's happening right in front of our eyes. The one legislative achievement of the Trump administration has been was the tax bill, which was presented as it was cleverly devised. So the first couple of years, a lot of people got a small tax rebate, but built into it was that declines. Within a couple of years, it turns out that the tax rate is being increased for the large majority of the population and being decreased sharply for the very rich. Okay. By now, believe it or not, for the first time in American history, billionaires are paying lower tax rates than working people. I mean, all of these things are going on before our eyes. Yes, it's led to people, for activists, these are the things they should be talking about. If the Democratic Party was seriously committed to the interests of the general population, they'd be front and center with this. Of course, they can't very easily because they've been involved in it. A lot of this was carried forward by Clinton, again by Obama, but so therefore they don't want to talk about it. But it's had a big impact. That's one of the reasons for the growth of anger, resentment, contempt for institutions in Europe as well, where similar things have happened. These are major phenomena. They should be brought to the population. They should be know that this has been a bipartisan assault against the general population for 40 years. It's had a lot more to say about it. But those are major things for activists in the United States. And it's similar in Europe and in other places where the neoliberal policies have been imposed.
Okay, we come to the end of this time, but if you have, Professor, a few more minutes, we'd like to select a couple more questions from the Q&A box.
Is that okay?
Can you try? I can't hear.
What Mojahideen asked is if you have a little bit more time, we'd like to ask you a few more questions.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, then let me go with this one. You talked about eliminating Israeli, the issues around eliminating Israeli nuclear weapons, and you talked about it in respect to Iran. The question is, how would that help the Palestinians?
Well, nuclear weapons don't harm the Palestinians. In fact, the role of nuclear weapons altogether is sharply contested. One of the leading Israeli strategists always has a long book studying this and arguing that nuclear weapons actually harmed Israeli security, because what they do is just encourage others to develop other means of attack or defense. Like Hezbollah was not intimidated by Israeli nuclear weapons. They drove Israel out of Lebanon, but not because of concern about nuclear weapons. So there's a real question whether they even do anything. But they're not directed against Gaza or the West Bank. What they do is threaten. They threaten destruction if you get in their way. Okay. And of course, use of nuclear weapons, we should understand, means suicide. Major use of nuclear weapons will bring on very likely bring on environmental effects which will destroy the attacker. This is true of the whole nuclear weapon system internationally. I mean, there's a lot to say about this. I don't know if we want to go into it, but it's a big topic.
Okay, thank you. Another question that's here is, what, if any, possibilities do the domestic protests against Netanyahu over corruption and his mishandling of the pandemic hold for future Jewish-Palestinian solidarity in Palestine?
This is Netanyahu or the United States or Trump?
Netanyahu is the question.
Netanyahu.
Yeah.
Well, it's caused protest in Israel of a kind of a mixed kind. Israel has a terrible record on the pandemic for a lot of reasons. One reason is because of the toleration of violations of any of the rules by the Orthodox population, which is a big population. And Netanyahu has genuflected to them for political reasons to try to hold his coalition together. But the general record in Israel is pretty bad, and there's a lot of protest about it. Corruption as well. I mean, Netanyahu's fighting for his life to keep from being tried for corruption. If he doesn't stay in office, he'd probably go to jail. So those are all internal Israeli problems. We can't do much about them.
Okay. There's a lot of questions. I'm just trying to figure out what would be good ones to ask right now.
Well, what I would suggest, actually, since it is getting late, is that people send me questions by email, or maybe send them to you and you could send on.
Okay.
How about that?
So they can use our website, Moshe?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, they can, as I said before, well, first, thank you, Professor Chomsky. You have always been very generous with your time, and I'd like to thank also my colleagues here, Ellen, Sarah, and Brooke, and Jennifer, and Elaine, and for making this a huge success, in my opinion. Thank you to the more than 300 and about 350 people who registered, and I urge you to start to stay connected with us. Email us at ArizonaPalestine at gmail.com. Visit our website, ArizonaPalestine.org, or our Facebook page. We'll go through all of these questions and try to organize them and answer them and publish them for you. And if you have any more comments and suggestions and questions, please send them over. We'd love to hear from you all the time. We meet once a month now via Zoom, which is on Wednesday, the third Wednesday of the month at 6:30. I hope you can join us. If you contact us, we'll send you the Zoom link. And thank you again very much, everybody. And together we appreciate your solidarity. We appreciate your support, and we shall overcome.
Very pleased to be with you. Thank you very much. Off to leave.